the second half of our program. I want to introduce to you another very celebrity fan base from Delaware State University. She just recently spoke at our recent commencement ceremony and gave a thrilling speech on really the impact of the students in the mass comm industry. So in the entertainment industry, we are introducing to you Ms. Kathleen Trigg, who will also be introducing to you our keynote speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello everyone, hello Delaware State University. Yes, Dover, Delaware, not only my alma mater, but also my hometown. Thank you. I think I arrived in Dover, Delaware in about 1970 maybe, and I grew up right up the street here. And it's my honor and my privilege to always come back and serve my university. I always talk about the sign that sat out front that I remembered and carried with me my whole time throughout my life when I graduated, and it said, "Go forth and serve." And I've never forgotten that. And I'd like to think that I'm a servant of God, first and foremost, but then I love the fact that I'm able to serve my university in so many capacities and also just serve our people. And to be here and to be a representative and a beacon of light and hope and love for us. So thanks for inviting me back home. It's an honor to introduce my next guest, our next guest, Mr. Benjamin Crump, who doesn't really need an introduction, but I'm going to give one. But before I even go there, I want to talk a little bit about my own love relationship with farming and agriculture, because you can't grow up in Dover, Delaware, and not be aware that farming, agriculture, is the #1 industry here in Delaware. I was a little disheartened to hear that black farmers, we represent about, I think there's 22 black farmers, if I'm not mistaken, in Delaware. 20, okay. And just under 100 black farmers. And we only make up about 1,000 acres of black farmland in this state. And yet it's the #1 industry in Delaware. So we've got to do something about that. You heard from John Boyd earlier, and I have John and I go back, I hate to say, almost 30 years. Yeah, it seems like yesterday, John, but yeah, it's been a really long time. But interestingly enough, so when I was a student here at Delaware State, I say I have a love love-relationship with agriculture, because when I was a student here at Delaware State, I had to find a way to pay my tuition. I was a single mother, and I took a job at one point. I'd say that it was, I don't want to down it because I know I'm in a room full of agriculture people, but I'd say that it was the job that probably made me know that I needed to stay in college and get a degree and do something with my life, because it wasn't a job that I wanted to make a career out of it, and that was working at ConAgra. And I remember, it paid well though, so I worked the 11 p.m. shift. This is how far, we sometimes come. I worked at 11 p.m. I took 18 to 21 credits a semester, drove to ConAgra, 11 p.m. until 7 a.m., and could not get the smell of chickens off of me. I drove back home in the morning, took a shower, and dropped my daughter off at school right here at the early childhood program, and went to class all day, studied in the evening, got a few little nap, and then went back, and I would see the sunrise when I was driving through the chicken farms and the not cotton fields. Here, I'm going way back. At one point, it was probably cotton fields, but it was the cornfields that I drove through, and I remember seeing the sunrise, thinking, you know what? One day I'm going to be something. I'm going to be on television, and I'm never going to have to drive to this factory again. And then, lo and behold, my first on-air job was as a news anchor at WAFL radio right back in Milford, and I did the morning shift right out of college. And once again, I was back driving through those cornfields, watched the sunrise in the morning, smelled, the smell. It either smells amazing to you, like John, or it's a smell that you kind of don't really, the chickens and the farms. But for me, it was a blessing to finally be on the air, because it was my dream. Then fast forward a year later, I got my first TV job right here at WBOC TV. And I was doing a story at the Agricultural Museum right up the street here, and I interviewed then Senator Joe Biden, who I formed a relationship with. and who a year later asked me to come work for him as his press assistant, which I did. And so now, of course, he's our president. But back then, it was such an amazing opportunity coming from what I came from. I was a foster kid. I was an orphan when my parents adopted me, a military family, and brought me here. So to come from that to then work for this senator and to see that trajectory, all because of this university, to me was incredible. Thank you. Fast forward, 2 years later, I take a job as a reporter in Richmond, Virginia, a reporter and anchor, and I met Mr. John Boyd. We were both pretty young then. He was fiery, like he said earlier. You thought he was fired up today. You should have seen him when he was, young, a little thinner, and ridiculously handsome. Still handsome. Put on a pound or two. It's all that chicken that he's been eating farming. But back then, I was a reporter, and Richmond, was the capital of the Confederacy. And there was a lot of racism, and I faced the KKK and a lot of Confederate flags and a lot of stories that were. I felt like I was representing our people on the air. But John was one of those people. His farm was being threatened. His father was fighting. He was fighting like hell. And I'd like to think that some of the coverage I gave him, and then obviously he had a huge vision, and he has just gone so far. John, I'm so proud to see you stay the course and everything that you've done for black farmers. Fast forward, I'm going to get to our guest, our special guest today, Mr. Ben Crump. A couple of years ago, actually a few years ago, Ben and I met when we were both charged with coming to the rescue of the family of Breonna Taylor. And as you all know, Ben Crump was instrumental in really fighting that battle and ensuring at least trying to bring international attention to the wrongs that had been, taken place against this young, beautiful black woman who was a servant. And Ben really led that cause. And I met him. I came down to provide coverage and support, through my platform, iWoman TV, and as a journalist. And that was a really tragic case. But it's just one of the many that our attorney, Black America's Attorney General, has come to the rescue of. And Ben didn't stop. Ben really stayed with the family of Breonna Taylor, just as he has so many other cases where our rights have been violated, where we have not been seen. You remember the catchphrase, "Say her name." And that is really because of Ben Crump and the team that surrounded Ben during that, but it's because of the spotlight that Ben was able to bring to that case. We worked together then. And then about 2 years ago, I had a call from a farm in Texas that was being taken away by 3 black farmers, bought the farm in 1968. And they, 3 brothers. And because of a lawsuit that had nothing to do with the farm, and John, you spoke about this earlier, the need to protect our assets and to understand the law and to understand who you're leaving your property to as a farmer. Find that farmer in your family, not necessarily the person, who's next in line. This farm, unfortunately, left fortunately, their daughter, who was a doctor. And they were getting older. They were in their 80s, 3 men, and they left the farm to their daughter, who was a doctor, and she ran into some issues with United Healthcare, with her medical practice, nothing to do with farming. But they put the farm in an irrevocable trust instead of a revocable trust. And so as a result, the lawsuit with United was going to take her family farm, a 500-acre family farm in Texas that had been in the family since 1968. And these 3 brothers in their 80s were devastated. It was going to destroy their family. And they called on me. I called on a few friends, including Ben and John, and they schooled me on farming and gave me the 101 and everything we needed to do. All I can say is I shut everything down in my company and made that my focus for the next 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks exactly, not only did we stop the sale, the auction of the black farm, United Healthcare was apologizing. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. We launched a social media campaign, a news campaign. We had every paper covering it. We were on it. Every social, civil rights activists that I knew, I called on, and we saved that farm, and it's still in their family today. That is the work of Ben and John and a few other friends. But Benjamin Crump, he is known as Black America's Attorney General, and I don't say that lightly. Ben has come to the rescue of our people when we're in need, when we're in dire need. He shows up and miracles happen. And it's not just because he's an amazing attorney. He is the head of the Ben Crump law firm. He's an incredible attorney, and that crosses over. He's not just our attorney, and I want to also set that straight. We happen to love on him, and we claim him as our own, but to be honest, I've watched Ben Crump walk in rooms with the president, with people in some of the richest people in the world, and in California and other places where we've had to come and do some genius work together, and he gets the same reception because he's brilliant and he's passionate and he cares so deeply about civil rights, about social justice, and about our people. He is a man of God. He is a father. He just celebrated. In fact, he's skipping his daughter's birthday, Brooklyn. It was yesterday, but they're celebrating to be here, and that's really important to us. I don't want to take too much more time, but I do want to say two things. I want you to stick around afterwards. There's some calendars that Ben has put together and his team has put together. They're beautiful calendars. They're being sold. He's going to take pictures with everyone here. Afterwards, you can come down. There's a special room downstairs. You buy a calendar, you take a picture. The proceeds are going to go to the Ben Crump Law School scholarships to help more underserved students be able to afford to attend this school, which is part of St. Thomas College, which is the most diverse law school in the country, and it's because of Ben Crump. So when you buy that calendar and you take a picture with Ben and you post it, more importantly, post it on your social media to spread the word, because he's raising money to make sure that more Ben Crumps can go out into the ecosystem and the universe and represent our rights. Without further ado, I want to show you a trailer of Ben's documentary. It's the most incredible documentary I have seen. I was at the screening a couple of years ago. It's amazing. It won an NAACP award. It was nominated for an Emmy. It's won the Tribeca Film Awards, and he's just going to keep on going. And there's more where that came from. So please watch the trailer, and the next voice you hear from will be that of my friend and my partner, Mr. Benjamin Crump.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, Black farmers. I'm so very honored to be here at the African American Farmers Association Conference to share with you, to engage with you, to empower you, and to make sure that our people are educated, because education is the key. But before I begin my arguments today, I would be remiss if I didn't thank Ms. Kathleen Trigg-Jones for that most generous introduction. You're a home girl, Kathleen. And I want to thank Professor Leandra Kaysen for, she deserves a great round of applause for doing this incredible conference. Incredible conference. I know my homegirl Monica Armstrong from the USDA. We want to thank them also for making this happen. And to many of the leaders, the elected officials here today, we thank them. And then also to Delaware State University, a great historically Black college and university. Thank you for having this occasion. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my investigator, Mr. Cliff Jones, because as Kathleen said yesterday, was I used to call her my 10-year-old boss, but now she's my 11-year-old boss, my daughter Brooklyn Zeta Crump's birthday. And so I flew in across the country to make sure I was there on time to receive her when her birthday started. And then I had to get up at 4:30 to catch a 6 a.m. flight to get from Tallahassee, Florida, because there are no direct flights from Tallahassee to Dover. But, you know, Cliff Jones made sure I got here, so I want to thank my main man, Cliff Jones, for getting me here. And then finally, I want to recognize a man who is far more than a client to me, far more than a friend, but he is a brother, and he is the last best chance to save the black farmer in the United States of America. And he exalts our rich history and culture and legacy of black farming being self-sustaining, a self-contained, a self-profit unit for black families in the black community. And that is John Boyd of the Black Farmers Association. I mean, you talk about some battles. John and I have fought battles. When they say you can't win, Kathleen, John doesn't understand that. I never forget when the Roundup litigation was going on, and you all have seen the commercials where the Roundup pesticide was being used all in homes, all on farms, and it was causing cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And when you think about who would use pesticides the most, it would be farmers. And it would be a lot of marginalized farmers who were not getting the proper education. See, the big farms, they were spending time with them. But the black farmers, the Hispanic farmers, the individual small family farmers who were fighting for survival, they weren't spending time with them, telling them how to protect yourself from having the Roundup getting on your hands, on your skin, into your pores, into your body. They weren't doing that with the black farmers. And so John and I talked, and I would never forget, because I understand from my personal hero, Thurgood Marshall, that when you're fighting for the life of marginalized people, especially black people in America, you have to fight in two courts, one in the court of law and another in the court of public opinion. Yeah. I would never forget, Madam Representative John Boyd, and they probably could have arrested us. But John Boyd and I went to the front line. We went to St. Louis, Missouri, where Bayer and Monsanto was headquartered. And we had a press conference talking about the fact that this settlement that they were trying to put through did not include the black farmers, but more importantly, it did not include any kind of health prevention and education for black farmers, because the reality was they used this Roundup for years, and even though the cancer may have not manifested itself today, what happens 5, 10 years, 20 years from now when these farmers start getting this cancer? And so we had the press conference, and we said they didn't care anything about black farmers. And it was so effective that I found out, and I didn't know this, because, Madison Avenue is so powerful. I mean, the commercials and stuff, they can make you forget things. And so Bayer aspirin is so American that most people think Bayer is an American corporation. Well, no, it's a German corporation. And so we did the press conference, and it was so effective that the lawyers said that, and it got made the front page in the newspapers in Germany too. And John, you remember they said, all right, we will meet with the black farmers and we will try to resolve the case. But you can't have Ben Crump go back and have no more press conferences calling us racist. And that's how effective John and I was, not just for him, but for hundreds and thousands of black farmers who didn't even know they had rights until John Boyd came forward and got them settlement funds. That's what this fight is about. So thank you, John. Thank you to your main lieutenant, your wife, Karen. Thank you, John. I'm looking out for you, John. So, I'm a trial lawyer. And when I speak, I'm always trying to make an argument to persuade the jury. So you all are the jury today. And we always start off in court asking permission to speak. So may it please this court, assembled here at the African American Farmers Association, I would like to present the argument to you of how they stole economic freedom from black people and how we can get it back if we can save the black farmers. You know, Professor Kaysen, we first have to start off with knowing our black history, because intelligent people understand and study history, because if you don't know what was, you can't understand what is. And that's really why you see people like Governor DeSantis and Governor Abbott and the governor in Virginia, all these governors and these enemies of equality, as I call them, are trying to prevent the teaching of black history. They're trying to ban books. I mean, think about it, in 2023, we're actually banning books. Let that sit in your mind for a minute. I mean, we are banning Maya Angelou. I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. They're banning Alice Walker's The Color Purple. They're banning James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. We better go tell it on the mountain. I mean, and quick. I mean, when you think about what they're doing, they are trying to stunt the exploration of the minds, especially of young people. I mean, it's censorship. It's the same thing that we condemn Russia and China for, but we're doing it in the United States of America in 2023. And I mean, I could not imagine that we would be banning books in 2023. But they're doing it for a reason, I argue, brothers and sisters. And it's the same reasons why they are trying to prevent the teaching of black history. They are talking about in Florida and Texas and many other states, Tennessee, where they will not fund anything, any programs with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, they are attacking diversity. We're having to relitigate that diversity is a good thing. I mean, Monica, who would have thought that in 2023 we would be having to argue about, no, it's good to have diversity. It's good to have more than just one opinion in the room. You know, I mean, it's asinine what these enemies of equality are doing in 2023. And I mean, talking about this revisionist history. I mean, in Florida, the Department of Education put forth that they were not going to allow the teaching of African American advanced placement history. And the governor said that African American advanced placement courses offered little to no value. Think about that. He said it offered little to no value for society. And then, a couple of months later, he followed it up when they came up with this idea, if they're going to have to talk about black history and if they're going to have to talk about slavery, even though they didn't want to do it because they said it would make little white children feel uncomfortable. Think about that. It would make their children feel uncomfortable because they might know what their grandmama and granddaddy did to black people. They said, if you're going to teach it from the 6th grade to graduation, when it comes to the part of American history when they started talking about the Civil War, that it was mandatory, that it was required, that they would have to teach the children that slavery had positive benefits for the enslaved people. That, no, slavery wasn't bad. Actually, it was good for your grandmama and granddaddy to be slaves. Can you imagine the psychological effect that would have on our children? Every year from the 6th grade all the way to the 12th grade being told that slavery was good for y'all. This revisionist history. And they don't want to teach history as it is. They don't want to teach the history that actually was American history. And I believe the reason people would try to prevent the teaching of history is because they plan on repeating it. And so we have to remember what Carter G. Woodson, the father of black history, said. He said, if a race has no history, if a race has no traditions or values that are respected enough to be taught to our children and the younger generations, then that race becomes a negligible thought in the mind of the world and thus becomes endangered of being exterminated from the face of the earth. So we have to vow that we won't let no governor of Florida or any other elected official exterminate our black literature, our black history, or our black culture. Now more than ever, we have to teach our children, not just black children, white children, everybody, about the value of black history. We have to push back against these enemies of equality and let them know without black history, there would be no American history. None. Wouldn't happen. We built this country. And it's so important that we continue to exalt black history, now more than ever, as they try to trivialize our existence, as they try to marginalize us, to make us seem that we are insignificant, that we are irrelevant, that we're inferior. Now more than ever, we have to speak truth to power, even when they talk about us. You know, my grandmother taught me when I was a little boy And my grandmother, to me, who only had an 8th grade education, Kathleen, you was talking about, farming and John, how that sustained our people for years. And that's why in this speech I'm talking about if we can save the black farmer, save the mentality of farmers, self-sustaining, a self-contained unit like they said in New Jack City. But my grandmother only had an 8th grade education, and in Lumberton, North Carolina, a little small town where I grew up, at a certain point in time, you stopped going to school because you had to go crop tobacco to try to sustain the family. But my grandmother had common sense wisdom. I've met all kind of PhDs and academics and so forth, but to this very day, my grandmother still, to me, is the wisest person I've ever met on the face of the earth. And my grandmother taught me when I was a little boy, she taught me many things. I mean, her wisdom was so deep, y'all. My grandmother would say stuff like, when we were little kids, and when I say my grandmother, I'm really talking about my great-grandmother. My grandmother died when I was 4 years old. She had 11 children. My mother was one of 11 because, in agriculture times, you did have big families because everybody was working farms and so forth, speaking to the black farmers. But my grandmother would keep a lot of her grandchildren and everything, and we were, like all children, we were trying to get out of going to school. And I remember I said to my grandma, "Oh, my grandma, it's raining real bad out there. It's a bad day. We got bad weather. We might can't go to school." And my grandmother, without missing a beat, would say, "There's no such thing as a bad weather day. It's just people who did not properly plan for the weather that day." That's how my grandmother was. I mean, she had an answer for everything. And my grandmother told me, she said, "Baby, if you ever get a chance to speak truth to power," she said, "you do it." She said, "you do it." She said, "Even if your knees are knocking," she said, "even if your palms are sweaty, even if your heart is racing, even if they talk about you, if they call you controversial, if they call you unpopular, if they say you race baiting, whatever they say," she said, "you still do it, baby." She said, "Because so many people sacrifice so much for you to have a chance to be in that room, and they will never be in that room. And if you don't speak and give them a voice, then they will never be heard." And so one of the things I do, it's not a popularity contest. We have to go fight for these noble concepts of equality and justice for all, the things that are always written on the back of the courtroom and so forth. We have to make them real. And the only way we make them real is we have to speak truth to power. So when we fighting for all of these hashtags that you've heard of, the Trayvon Martins, the Breonna Taylors, the George Floyds, the Tyree Nichols, what you're fighting for is them to acknowledge and respect the humanity in our children, in our people, in our communities, in our culture. And so that's why we keep doing it. Even when they talk about us, the height of arrogance is to think everybody gonna love you. It ain't about that. It's about trying to make sure our children know that we believed in them, that we were willing to fight for them, and if need be, that we were willing to die for them. That's what this is about. And so that's why our history is so important. And we have to document it, that the reason we are so blessed today was because of our great grandparents and our grandparents. I mean, can you imagine what the black people had to endure in states like Delaware and Virginia for us to be able to come and get this great education from Delaware State University? What they had to sacrifice, how many times they were beaten and raped and sold and kidnapped. I mean, all these things they had to sacrifice, but yet they still couldn't keep us down. And so that's what this is about, y'all, making sure they understand the history of our people, that not just our children, but everybody understands the history. John Boy, they have to understand the history and the legacy of 40 Acres and a Mule. They have to understand that if blacks would have gotten 40 Acres and a Mule, that would be about $6.4 trillion of wealth for our people that was stolen from us. And because I'm trying to make the argument, I wanna break it down. I want to give you all some empirical evidence. You know, they teach us in law school about different forms of evidence. You know, you have circumstantial evidence, that is, that people can reason and debate about. You have, obviously, physical evidence. You have objective evidence. You have firsthand eyewitness evidence. You have, hearsay evidence. But by far, the best evidence you could ever offer is empirical evidence. Evidence that is beyond debate, that nobody can dispute. Like when they go out there and they look in the sky and they say it's sunlight right now. Well, that's not debatable. That's empirical evidence. And when we think about what was taken from us with 40 Acres and a Mule, we can offer empirical evidence. And before I get to that, it's about economic freedom. Because if you don't have economic freedom, Professor Kaysen, then all the other freedoms become way more challenging in a capitalistic society. Freedom and access to capital, freedom and access, impedes your freedom and access to quality health care. Denial to economic freedom impedes your access to quality education. I mean, if you don't have economic freedom, every other freedom becomes a little more out of reach. And I think about this lawsuit that I'm fighting for, the Fearless Fund. These two black women who graduated from another great historically black college and university, Florida A&M. And the fact that their crime or their sin, if you believe Edward Bloom, this guy who gutted affirmative action in higher education when he sued the University of North Carolina and Harvard and said that, it's kind of deep it's asinine really, but he said that, that black people and Hispanic people had an unfair competitive advantage because of affirmative action. And now, being a lawyer and legally educated, I'm baffled by the Supreme Court ruling in his favor, because this was all theory. And I thought you had to make rulings based on evidence. And where is the evidence of this unfair advantage that black people have in America, in higher education, in net worth, in property ownership and land ownership. I mean, there's no evidence at all that black people have an unfair advantage where we have anywhere equal to net worth of white people in America, where we have anywhere equal to property ownership to white people in America, where we have nowhere equal, where we have executive C-suite positions to white people in America. I mean, there is no evidence of that, but yet they made this ruling, and when they made this ruling, they said it was only going to be pertaining to higher education. But we knew that wasn't true, because the enemies of equality were not going to stop. And this Edward Bloom guy has raised almost $1 billion to just sue everything that is affirmative for people of color. Any kind of civil rights progress, he's suing. And he's saying it's reverse discrimination. And so that's what he then sued these two black women, these brilliant sisters who started the Fearless Fund. Kathleen is helping with that cause as well. I mean, she really is great when it comes to fighting for black women and black women causes. But they said that because these young black women raised $100 million to be able to invest in black women and brown women and women in general, businesses, because they did that to help them be able to have investments, because black women are the most founded of all black businesses, but they are the least funded. I mean, black women make miracles. I was raised by a black single mother, so I understand black women make miracles every day, all day. They start daycares, they start restaurants, they start hair salons. I mean, they just do all kind of miracles, and they hardly ever get funded like the kids in Silicon Valley or anywhere else. And so because they were intentional about saying we were going to help black women start businesses, they were sued and called everything but a child of God, when they should have been celebrated and exalted. They were ambushed and sued. And if we don't stand up for those black women and they take them down, they will not be the last. They will be emboldened. They will then start coming after everything. I could see them starting to attack HBCUs, because they say anything where you're intentional about helping people of color be able to get equality in America, oh, no, no, no. That's wrong. That's reverse discrimination. And they are so disingenuous about it. They're using the Civil Rights Act of 1866, a law that was supposed to encourage black businesses to attack black businesses, because they're trying to use the phrase where you can't consider race when in contracting. Well, that was because in 1866, in these United States of America, it was illegal for white people to contract with black people. And now they're trying to turn it on its head and say, no, no, because of this law, if you are intentional about helping black people or brown people or native people, then you are violating the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And the truth of the matter is this here. This Supreme Court, I write about it in my book, Open Season, the legalized genocide of colored people. If you look at the history of the rulings, I don't care what it is, what kind of case it is, you find a pattern that poor people of color get the most of injustice and the least of justice in every situation. And that's why we have to continue to fight on every front to talk about our black history. And no matter how many times they tried to keep us down, they could never keep us down. That's right. Ben Franklin said that democracy is like two wolves and a lamb fighting about what to have for lunch. You ain't got to be no genius to know how that vote gonna go. But he said liberty is making sure that that lamb is well armed to protest that vote. And so that's what we got to do. We got to make sure our young lambs, those young marginalized lambs, those young lambs of color are well armed to protest that vote that have them targeted for the school to prison pipeline. We have to make sure these young lambs of color are well armed to protest the voter suppression. We have to make sure the young lambs of color are well armed to protest the denial of access to capital. We have to make sure that young lambs of color are well armed to protest the denial of access to quality health care. We got to make sure that our young lambs of color are well armed to be able to fight anything that these enemies of equality can think of to try to keep them down. And we have to make sure that our young lambs are armed not with these AK-47s or these assault weapons or guns or these means. We have to make sure that our young lambs of color are well armed with intellect and strategic thinking and diplomacy. If you remember nothing I say here today at this luncheon, I want you to remember this one thing. The enemies of equality cannot win this war. They will not win this struggle in this battle for equality and justice as long as we do this. And that is make sure that our children are more intelligent than those who will seek to oppress them. And so that's why we fight for the physical. You got to be strategic. I'll give you one quick example, then I'll give my evidence, and then I'll ask for your verdict. You always have to be strategic. I mean, when we sued Harvard for the slave photographs for the black woman, Miss Tamara Lanier, that they're making a movie about, it was kind of deep because, you know, they said we had no standing. It was a 150-year-old lawsuit. Harvard had these photographs called daguerreotypes, some of the earliest known photographs still in existence in the world today. And I know time, I may not have the time, but it was just this racist Harvard professor named Louis Agassiz, while Abraham Lincoln was talking about Emancipation Proclamation, John Boyd, he was running around America saying, no, I can prove blacks are inferior to white people and that we should keep slavery. We shouldn't get rid of them because they are more agrarian than that. Their bodies were built to work in the fields and all this lunacy. And so to prove his racist theories, and Harvard was celebrating them now, Harvard was promoting them. And you'll know why in just a minute when I talk about what 40 acres and a mule meant to American, how it stole economic freedom from black people. Louis Agassiz wanted visual evidence. He wanted ocular proof to prove the inferiority of black people. And so he went around the country looking for a true African. Because you got to remember, by 1850, the slave masters had raped and commingled with so many of our mothers and grandmothers that, you know, there were not what he called the pure Africans because they had white blood in them. And he didn't want that, any of that. He wanted to try to find a pure African to photograph so he could have visual evidence to support his racist theories that blacks were inferior. So he went down to Columbia, South Carolina, which if you study history, you know over 65% of all the slaves that came into America came in through Charleston and Columbia, South Carolina. And on the Ben F. Taylor plantation, he found Congo Renti, affectionately known as Papa Renti. And this was his pure African because they had banned the importation of slavery in the 1820s, and so there were not many what they call Africans that had not been produced by black people already in America and white men mostly, and black women. So he found Congo Renti and his daughter. It ain't, you know, photos today are much more different than they were back in 1850. You all know you would have to take the photograph, you would have to stand there still for like 40 minutes to an hour, or with an hour and a half while the photo will go through photosynthesis and develop. And so they stripped Papa Renti down naked in a group of white men, and they measured his buttocks, they measured his male genitalia, they measured his lips, all this stuff to try to prove that his biology was more prone to agriculture, agrarian work. And then after they did that to Papa Renti, they took his daughter, which many historians believe was about 18, 19, maybe 20 years old, and they stripped her naked. And she had to stand there for about an hour in front of all these white men as they were taking measurements of her lips, her breasts, her buttocks, her thighs. And in the photograph, the daguerreotype that was produced, and one of them, they have a single tear coming down from her right side of her eye. And Yale professor wrote a book called Delia's Tear. Her name was Delia. And she said that tear represented the rape, sexual assault, and misogyny that women of color had to endure since they was first brought to North America in the United States. And it was deep because you can't imagine the duress that they must have had to stand there being humiliated with strange people with touching and feeling on their bodies while they had to stay frozen for the picture because, as they said, you couldn't move because it would mess up the picture. And if they moved, they would beat them. And so these photographs are believed now to be worth about $100 million. And we sued on behalf of this black woman who made her mother a promise on her deathbed that she would let them know that Papa Renti, that man in that photograph at Harvard, was their grandfather, and that he was not illiterate as they try to make him out to be. Because, if they can say you're illiterate, that means, oh, you shouldn't care about him much. He didn't matter. No, she said he was not only intelligent, he taught himself to read and write the English language, but he also knew the African dialect, and that's why everybody gravitated to him, because he was teaching them about their culture back in Africa, as well as he knew how to read the blue back Bible. And I mean, he was a brilliant man, but they tried to strip him down to as he was nothing. And so, long story short, we sued. We on the lower court level, they said, no, you crazy, Ben Crump, statute of limitations, y'all can't win, it's way too long. We were suing for intentional infliction of emotional distress and fraudulent concealment. Because all these things that apply to white people, when we try to apply them to black people, they start coming up with reasons why it don't apply. We get the most of injustice and the least of justice. But we serve a God who sits high and looks low. The Massachusetts Supreme Court granted us a writ of certiorari, so we got to argue before the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And I'll say my first statement that I said to the Supreme Court, and then I'll move on because I know time is getting late. I went up there before them, and I said, I am Ben Crump, and I come before you as an attorney, but not just as an attorney, as a civil rights attorney, but not just as a civil rights attorney, but as a black man, but not just as a black man, but as a free black man. Because over 200 years ago, in this very Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts, individuals sitting right where you were sitting at made a courageous decision that changed the course of human history when they became the first state to judicially abolish slavery in the United States of America. So I come before you on this day to see if you have the same courage to finally free Papa Renty and Delia from bondage of Harvard University. And as my grandmother would say, it was so quiet in that courtroom that you could hear a rat piss on cotton. And even though we argued, there were like 10 cases slated before the Massachusetts Supreme Court that day, and normally they take about 30 days, 45 days to issue a ruling. Came back 30, 45 days, John, Kathleen, cases that were there with us, they made rulings on those, and then we waited another 30, 45 days, 3 months later, they still hadn't ruled. Cases that came after us, they ruled on them, then we got 6 months down the road, they still hadn't ruled, and you're like, man, it's like when a jury out, you start trying to theorize what's going on, and I'm always one to try to see the glasses half full. Cliff Jones, I kept saying, well, if they were going to rule against us, that would have been easy. They could have just said dismissed and so forth. Harvard wins. But almost 10 months later, the court came back and rendered a unanimous decision in favor of Ms. Tamara Lanier, denying Harvard's motion to dismiss, saying that she has a right in court. And because every now and then the stars line up, it's not often. Not only did they say she have a right to bring the case in court, but they said she also herself had a right for intentional infliction of emotional distress because Harvard kept lying to her every time she was trying to say, I have documentation. I've traced all the slave papers. I went and got all the probate papers from court to show that Ben F. Taylor owned Papa Renty Taylor, and that when Renty had children and the slave master had children, they would name their children the same thing. I mean, she did all this stuff. And Harvard said, you crazy. You have no evidence and everything. Because they always tell black people we crazy when we try to assert our rights. And the court said, we even going to acknowledge her right to have a claim against Harvard. So that's why we have to always keep talking about history. Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks. They called us crazy then, too. Y'all know the story of Henrietta Lacks. You know, medical racism in America in the 50s was rampant. You had Tuskegee syphilis experiment where they injected the black men with syphilis even though they had a cure, and would not treat them, and they went and had relations with the women, and the women got syphilis. Then they went and gave the children syphilis, and this went on for over 3 decades. And in Mississippi, they had the Mississippi appendectomy, where black women would go to the hospitals and doctors for routine medical treatments, and they would sterilize them. The most famous of the black women being Fannie Lou Hamer, the great civil rights icon who said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. She was 23 years old, went for a routine medical checkup, and they sterilized her. And when she realized what happened, because she was one of the few black women in Mississippi who had advanced college degrees, she then went and started trying to tell people about what was going on, that they were sterilizing black women. And it wasn't just in Mississippi. It was in Georgia and North Carolina and Tennessee, because they were trying to stop black population from increasing in the South. And, you know, I digress to say, you know, they say they discriminate against black people in the South. Malcolm X once famously said, I've been told that they discriminate against black people in the South. Where he said, my definition of the South is anything beneath the Canadian border. Because last time I checked, they discriminated against black people all over America. And so Fannie Lou Hamer was doing that, and obviously in Baltimore, Maryland, at Johns Hopkins Hospital, medical racism was alive and well. They were trying to find out if a human cell could survive outside the human body. And we don't know how many hundreds of thousands of black people they experimented on before they got to Henrietta Lacks. They were using black people as guinea pigs, as lab rats, just experimenting on it. And what they did to this sister is god-awful. There's nowhere around it. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer that was completely treatable. She was only 32 years old, in the prime of her life. She went there. They never tried to treat her because they weren't trying to treat black people. They were trying to experiment on our bodies because they said we were irrelevant. And what they did to her, they put radiation rods inside her female organs. I'm trying to be respectful. Took 2 radiation rods and they opened up and they cut part of her that wasn't cancerous and they cut part of her that was cancerous. Understand, y'all, radiation rods, my little brother is going through, he has lung cancer, and so I'm learning a lot more about radiation and the use of radiation it is so potentially harmful to the body, potentially fatal, that they have you take chemotherapy, many rounds of it, before they actually use the radiation, because they know the radiation is harmful to the body. It could kill you. And so they give you chemotherapy to try to reduce the size of the tumor so small till they can use the least amount of radiation, because they know the impact they have on the body. Well, they didn't give a dang, and I'm trying to be respectful, about this black woman at all. They put 2 radiation rods in her and took how much time they needed to cut her cells out her body, and she died a god-awful death. She lived 8 more months, and her family talked about how she would moan and scream in pain for the last 8 months of her life. She was a wife, a beautiful, intelligent woman. They try to say she couldn't read or write, but again, as I told you, they always try to say we're illiterate because they don't want you to have consideration for the person. And she had 5 children, little children, the oldest being 16, the youngest being 6 months when she had that procedure, and she died awful death. And there's something biblical about Henrietta Lacks. I mean, she sacrificed so much, even her life, but it contributed so much to the world because of her miraculous cells, her immortal cells. I mean, I'm not surprised at all, that the first cells in the course of human history that could survive outside the human body was that of a black woman. I'm not surprised at all. I mean, not only did her cells survive, but they regenerated every 24 hours. And it's miraculous because 70 years now, her cells still regenerate. This cell regenerates, and then 24 hours later, it regenerates on its own. I mean, they had never seen anything like it. She is truly the mother of modern medicine because of every vaccine, every medicine, every scientific research made in modern medical history. They used her HeLa cells. I mean, that's who Henrietta Lacks was. And they didn't want them to know it was a black woman. It wasn't, this happened in 1951. It wasn't until 1972 to European doctors in Switzerland were having a conference, and they said, my God, these cells are incredible. We need to find out how these cells came to be. Whose cells were these? Where did y'all get these cells from? Doctors at Johns Hopkins, and then they finally admitted, that it was a black woman. They lied at first and said it was a white woman, John. Came up with a name for her and everything. Helen somebody. But then they was in the scientific journals, and black people still didn't know. And her family says it best. It wasn't until they published it in Jet magazine that black people started to learn about who Henrietta Lacks was. And it gets even more deeper, y'all, because when we sued, they try to act like the family wasn't trying to do anything. Lawrence Lacks and his children, Ron Lacks, and one of her children died as a child, but so she had 4 surviving children. And they called me almost 3 years ago on Juneteenth, and they said, will you help us sue these pharmaceutical companies who are making billions upon billions upon billions of dollars using our mother's cells? And it was kind of deep because I was like, well, did y'all do anything before? And they said, yeah, we have been trying, but the courts just kept dismissing us. And so I'm kind of crazy a little bit. My law partners and them was like, hey, man, I said, we did it on Harvard, you know. And I do believe what my grandmother said, nothing beats a failure like a try. And so we filed the lawsuit under the theory of unjust enrichment, which is a well-established legal principle that says the wrongdoer should not be able to continue to benefit from the wrongdoing. Yeah, and all of these companies knew about where these Hiller sales came from. They just didn't give a damn. And so what you had happen when we were in that courtroom, we filed, and the pharmaceutical company lawyer said, Judge, Attorney Crump is crazy if he thinks he can overcome a 70-year statute of limitation. And we objected, and the judge said, all right, he's an officer of the court. We're not going to let you say any, derogatory things about any officer of the court and so forth. So they apologized for it, but what they said is, we don't understand how he supposes to get around the statute of limitations. In most states in America, the statute of limitations is like 2 to 3, at most 4 years. You got 3-4 years to bring the lawsuit, or you're forever barred, right, Monica? And so they were saying, how does he get around this? And so the judge looked like she was giving him consideration, so she looked at me and she said, Attorney Crump, do you suppose the court rules in your favor in light of the statute of limitation? And I said, I understand that argument, Judge. In fact, we anticipated it. But as we argued here in this courtroom this very day, Henrietta Lacks is unprecedented. And so her immortal sales are unprecedented, Your Honor. We just articulated to you all that her sales regenerates every 24 hours. So Judge, understand, from 1951 to 2018, the family is not asking for a percentage of those profits. We understand we are barred by the statute of limitations. But just like we said, Judge, every 24 hours, her sales regenerate. And so those sales that regenerated yesterday, the family expects a percentage of all those profits. Of all those profits. And so the judge was like, okay. And then the other argument they made, the final argument they made, and we'll take it on home with this here, was they said, well, Your Honor, what happens 50 years from now when her great-grandchildren come up and they start to sue us and say that they deserve a percentage of the profits? And so it seemed like the judge again, Kathleen, was giving it some consideration. So she looked over at our table, and my co-counsels said, Ben, I think you should take this one too, and so forth. And so I said, okay. And remember, y'all, I said what my grandmother taught me about speaking truth to power. It's on the court record. I'm sure the transcript will be, they're making a documentary about this truly historic case too. But it was deep because it was a courtroom packed, and I said, Judge, my grandmother taught me to speak truth to power, so I'm going to speak truth to power because you are uniquely positioned with the power to right this wrong more than anybody else. And I said that if I understand the question correctly, what my most learned adversary is asking the court is, what if they didn't treat Henrietta Lacks, or what if they treated Henrietta Lacks like a white woman? And they went to her and they asked for her permission and had to get her consent to take her cells out her body. And she had to give informed consent, and her family would have been made aware of this consent and what they were doing, and that if there were anything derived from these experiments with her genetic materials, then that they will have a right to be compensated for essentially what was her intellectual properties and gifts to society and civilization. What if they wouldn't have treated her like a black woman who was looked at as insignificant and inferior and illiterate? What if they would have treated her like a white woman? I guess that's the question that they're trying to ask, Your Honor. And I guess we don't have to speculate about what would happen if they treated her like a white person, because we see examples everywhere in America. You take Henry Ford, for instance, who created the automobile. He gave that intellectual property to the world. And nobody questions that his children and their children and their children and their great-grandchildren and their great-grandchildren will be able to benefit and derive profits when the world uses their intellectual properties. And Mary Kate Ash, the woman who gave intellectual properties in the field of cosmetics, and her children and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren will be able to derive profits forever in perpetuity for her intellectual properties. Why is it, Your Honor, when it's a black family who are saying we have a right to derive compensation and profits from the intellectual properties that, in fact, the genetic material of our grandmother, you have a problem with it? And so we serve a God that sits high and looks low. Yeah, and this is truly poetic justice. Man, July 31st, judge sends us to settlement conference, says she ain't gonna dismiss our case. And so it's like a open and shut matter at that point. We gonna settle the case. We figure out what we're gonna settle for and everything. So we get there, John Boyd, and we get there like at 8 in the morning, federal court in Baltimore, Maryland, Eastern District Court. And I actually planned a press conference for 12 noon. I'm supposed to be flying to Minneapolis for the Black Lawyers Convention to speak that night. We get there, and at 11 o'clock come, I'm like, man, I don't know if I'm gonna make my 1:30 flight. And so it get 12:30, I tell my associate, move my flight, put me on the 4 o'clock flight. Man, these jokers, they keep fighting about all kind of terms and so forth. It come up on 3 o'clock, I say, man, all right, move me to the 7 o'clock flight. I know I missed the speech, but at least I get there tonight so I can be there in time for the events for tomorrow. We come up on 6 o'clock. They got like one last flight leaving from DCA to Minneapolis like at 9:30, and y'all know you got to drive from Baltimore. And I tell them, all right, book that flight for me. Man, we in that courthouse to about 12:30 at night, coming up with the settlement agreement. But what they meant for bad, God meant for good. Because to be such smart lawyers representing the pharmaceutical companies, they must not have studied the file that much. Because we were going to do the press conference, it's probably going to get little fanfare. And so on July 31st. But because they took us into the wee hours of the morning, it made us have to have the press conference at 10 a.m. on the next morning, which was August 1st, which, had she been living, would have been Henrietta Lack's 103rd birthday. And so a case that was going to get little attention went viral because we were finally able to give Henrietta Lacks a present for what she had gave us. And so, you know, that's why we have to keep fighting, talking about history. I'll quickly tell you, 40 Acres and a Mule, slavery launched modern capitalism and turned the United States, a relatively young country, into the wealthiest country in the world. Cotton built New York City into the commercial and financial center of the world. For every dollar cotton made, about 40 cents ended up in New York City as the city supplied insurance, shipping, and financing. Y'all do understand life insurance was started because of slavery. They had to have insurance because if something happened to us, they treated us as property. And then it evolved a little bit, and then they said, well, if we get, you know, insurance if the slave dies, then what about if the overseer dies? He's valuable to our product too. So they started insuring the white overseers, and then it evolved to life insurance. Second, emancipation did not bring economic freedom to former slaves. No 40 Acres and a Mule. $300 per slave on April 16, 1862. President Abraham Lincoln signed a bill ending slavery in the District of Columbia and provided compensation to former slave owners. Y'all get that? They pay the slave owners. You're talking about making an argument for reparations. Number 3, discriminatory policies then kept African Americans from receiving help that other citizens received. And we can go all into that there. The social safety nets had missed African Americans. Social Security originally excluded domestic and agricultural workers who was almost 95% African American, especially in the South. They gave it to everybody except us. Number 4, the result, African Americans have not been able to get a foothold in the economy. And they talk about the wealth gap in America. Martin Luther King, during the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King calculated that making good on the promise of 40 Acres and a Mule, which was $20 a week since the late 1700s, 1800s, for 4 million slaves, would total $800 billion, and this was in mid-1960s. And he talked about America had a promissory note that was due. And then, obviously, we know that African Americans, the wealth gap now is in savings. Black people in America, on average, only save about $22,000 compared to white people in America who save $300,000. And so it's just clear evidence of what was taken from us. I'll leave you with this. Now more than ever, we have to fight to be self-sufficient. She talked about those calendars. I'm suing half of the corporations in America for discrimination. And so I know with this law school that bears my name, where we're trying to educate the next generation of civil rights lawyers and social justice warriors to go to the front line and fight, that if you're suing them, they ain't gonna donate to your law school. And I don't care, because I said we have to do it ourselves. So we're gonna raise this $2 million a year ourselves to get these black and brown children scholarship funds. Because at the end of the day, it's what Martin Luther King said. The coward is gonna ask the question, is it safe? He said expediency is gonna ask the question, is it politically correct? He said vanity gonna come along and ask the question, is it popular? But then he said conscience comes along and asks the question, is it right? And Dr. King said there comes a time when one must take a position that's neither popular nor politically correct or not even safe. But he said there comes a time when one must take a position because their conscience tells them it is the right thing to do. I submit to you, brothers and sisters, here at the African American Farmers Association Conference, that it is the right thing to do to stand up for our children's future. It is the right thing to do to speak up for our children's future. It is the right thing to do to fight for our children's future. Because if we ain't willing to fight for our children's future, we can't expect nobody else to come and fight for our children's future. And we got to be willing to fight for our children's future. I mean, when they come and say, Daddy, Mama, do y'all really believe Black Lives Matter? It can't even be a question in our children's mind. They got to see, not because of we saying it, but they got to see it because of our actions. They got to see it with their own eyes. We got to be willing to fight for them, to let them know that their lives matter, that we're willing to fight to the death because we believe in our children's future too. We got to be willing to fight until hell freezes over. And then we got to be willing to fight on the ice. Thank you. God bless you.